So the final thing we're going to talk about is kind of the differences in the costs between the short run and the long run. So short run, so SR versus long run. So LR is for long run here. So the main differences are in the short run, there are some fixed costs. So there's some parts of production that you don't really have control over. You know, you have a factory of a certain size. You can't really change that in the short run. So you have some fixed costs, you have some factors, maybe this is a better way to put it, some factors of production are fixed, which kind of means that you have some fixed costs. So think about, like, you have a certain size factory or something like that. In the short run, there's nothing you can do about that. Well, we can differentiate that from the long run. And in the long run, there are no fixed costs because there are no fixed factors. Fixed factors, it's not supposed to be anything. Factors of production. So in the short run, you know, in some ways in the short run you're constrained with you know, certain production facilities or things like that. Where in the long run we can think of, you know, in the long run we could change the size of our factory. We could think about, you know, changing our production process to a different factory, or moving our factory, or expanding or shrinking our factory or production size. So that's the big difference between the short run and the long run. And so when we think about the long run, if you remember from one of the first modules, we talked about the long run average cost curve. So we talked about this in the context of trade and kind of gains from trade, and how, you know, there's learning by doing and economies of scale if you start to specialize in the production of the goods, so you start to maybe realize more gains than we originally thought in terms of gains from trade. We're going to kind of revisit that graph in a second and kind of talk about kind of where it comes from. And we'll kind of revisit economies of scale in terms of increasing economies of scale and maybe these decreasing economies of scale that kind of are a bit confusing because it's hard to imagine. So let's turn our attention to what the long run cost curve looks like. And so we've kind of seen this before when we talked about gains from trade, and how, you know, if we specialized, we could increase the gains from trade due to economies of scale, as well as kind of learning by doing. So we talked about this graph, or this graph called the long run average cost curve, or this function, I guess, called the long run average cost curve. And so if you remember, we had the cost per unit, you know, the dollars in terms of cost per unit, or yen, or whatever, pounds. And we had the quantity on the x-axis. So our y-axis was the cost per unit, our x-axis is the quantity. And we kind of had this certain curve, and let's just draw it a particular way anyway. So it's decreasing at the beginning. Let's say it's flat at a certain point, and let's say it goes up here. And this is our long run average cost curve. So what this is saying is, when we allow all the factors of production to vary, this is like what the minimum cost of production at each possible level of production is. And it has certain, we kind of talked about this before, but it had certain properties, right? So anywhere here we had economies of scale. So remember, that meant as we increased production, the cost per unit was falling. Might call this QM, which is maybe, I should put QM down here and say this is the minimum efficient scale. And so what the minimum efficient scale is the level of production that gives you the minimum cost per unit. So this is the level of production, it's the minimum level of production that minimizes this long run average cost curve. Between these 2 points, we have constant economies of scale. So the cost curve is kind of flat there, so increasing production doesn't increase or decrease the average cost per unit. And then as soon as we get past this point here, we have diseconomies of scale. So this is when, as we produce more units, the average cost of production is going up. So, this was kind of a harder concept to get our heads around when that's going to take place, kind of when you have this big bloated bureaucracy, or it's really hard to communicate maybe between managers and workers, and there's kind of cost overruns and cost breakdowns and things like that. But we kind of have these 3 different parts of this cost curve. If we had just kind of a parabola, we might not have this constant economies of scale portion. And so, this is the graph where if we let all of the production vary. And so if you remember when we looked at our short run graphs, we had the cost we just had cost up here, and we had the quantity here. We had this kind of check mark for the marginal cost curve. And then we had this average total cost curve where the marginal cost went through that minimum point of the average total cost. And we called, this was that minimum cost point. Like this was the level of production given this kind of factory size, given the fixed kind of factors of this graph. This is the amount of production that minimized costs, right? And so how we're kind of coming up with this long run average cost curve is it's kind of the result of all these different short run cost curves. So this is like short run average total cost 1, and we have a second one. It's kind of, I guess, an infinite amount of them, and the minimum points of all these short run average total cost curves are what's producing this long run average cost curve. So in the long run, it's thinking about, well, what's the minimum cost at different levels of production? It's figuring out what size factory gives us the lowest cost per unit for this level of production here. And this short run average total cost here is that short run average total cost from the factory size that minimizes the long run cost of this. So that's what's going on with the long run costs in our given our production function and given what's happening in the short run.